several officers were part of a plot to assassinate Manley in July, one of at least 3 such attempts which the CIA was directly involved in. If you grew up in Jamaica in the 80s and 90s, you might have heard stories about the CIA's involvement in Jamaican politics and Siaga's alliances with the US government to topple Manley's administration. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to paraphrase and leave out a lot of the details. But basically, Michael Manley had an agenda for democratic socialism. And a big part of his agenda was that he wanted to nationalize particularly the bauxite companies that were, at the time when he took over in 72, mainly foreign owned. Manley's plan included making education more accessible, making land and housing more accessible, and making social services available to the masses of the people to uplift the mainly poor working class Jamaicans. Now, Manley intended to pay for all this with the implementation of a large tax, large enough, right, on the bauxite industry so that the government would earn more from this industry and that we could have more money. The country could earn more money from bauxite to spend in the country because most of the profits were going overseas anyway. In retaliation, the bauxite companies began producing less, and they did everything they could to sabotage the Manley government. Under democratic socialism, Manley government imposed a bauxite production tax on the aluminum companies, raised taxes, and nationalized a number of foreign-owned enterprises against intense resistance from the multinational corporations, the local capitalist class, the US, and other Western governments. There was massive backlash from the elite class. They started to move their money overseas out of the country, starving the Manley government of much needed foreign capital that they needed to buy, the goods and services from abroad that people depended on. Hence some of the shortages that people experienced at that time. Historians had doubt that it would succeed, and one said, for the criticism leveled at it by the United States, the Manley government was never a radical government with a plan for a substantial restructuring of the economy. The PNP had not formulated an overall plan to mobilize domestic agriculture and industrial workers. So there was doubt that in the long run, it really would have worked anyway. He really needed to incorporate the stakeholders a bit more than the way he was going about it. But nevertheless, it rattled the neighbors up north. Manley's pronouncements panicked the local capitalists and the upper class, who became convinced that the PNP government was moving Jamaica towards communism and that their businesses and properties would be confiscated. They also incurred the wrath of the US, whose response to the Manley regime's new posture was a sustained effort to destabilize Jamaica's economy. The United States government portrayed Jamaica as a pawn of Cuba and the Soviet Union, just as it did with Grenada before the invasion, and vowed to get rid of the Manley socialist regime at any cost. Kissinger had arrived in Jamaica in December 1975 to suggest to Manley that he change his policies or else US-Jamaican relations would be reviewed. So several years into Manley's administration, the economic aid dried up and the investments dried up and the tourism had slowed. The upper class had removed most of their money from the economy. Some had fled. The destabilization efforts were really at their peak. In 1977, 2 investigative reporters from Penthouse had gotten information from American intelligence sources about the destabilization program that was drawn up by the CIA. As quoted in Blum's book, politics in Jamaica had long been spiced with strong-arm tactics, but this now intensified in both frequency and deadlines, and in the use of arson, bombing, and assassination. The CIA quickly sought to organize and expand the violence. Shipments of guns and sophisticated communications equipment began to be smuggled into the island. In one shipment alone, which was grabbed by Manley's security forces, there were 500 submachine guns. Another section said a cargo of flour brought to Jamaica on a German ship, the Heidelberg, was discovered to have been contaminated with an insecticide which had been banned from Jamaica for many years. Much of the flour had already been sold, and about 17 people died from it in December 1975 and January 1976. Later in the year, in October, a large shipment of rice from Costa Rica arrived to relieve a rice shortage Jamaicans had been suffering through for months. This too was found to be contaminated by poison and had to be destroyed. The two incidents are reminiscent of the contaminations of sugar carried out by the CIA against Cuba. In another section, it says, mobilization of the middle class into CIA-created anti-government organizations to carry out well-publicized demonstrations. Groups with names such as Silent Majority and Christian Women Agitators for Truth were formed, the latter attacking those who criticized the United States and the CIA. With liberal bribes, the CIA turned many security personnel into paid informants for the agency. Several officers were part of a plot to assassinate Manley in July. One of at least 3 such attempts which the CIA was directly involved in. Another in September employed Cuban exiles. The third turned to Jamaican gunmen to do the job. The last was in December, a final act of desperation on election night. All 3 attempts failed. Not even a shot was fired, and Manley easily won re-election. This was in 1976, I believe. During the campaign, CIA officer James Holt was accused of contriving a plot to turn the military against Manley's People's National Party. According to the accusation, a tape of a PNP youth rally was spliced with a message purporting to be from Fidel Castro, urging young people to rise up in armed struggle against the police and the army. The tape was supposed to fall into the hands of the military and cause dissension. Propagandists arrived from the United States as well. Evangelists and faith healers came down to set up their tents and preach against communism and the government to the highly religious population. Manley was defeated for re-election in October 1980, due primarily to a continuing deterioration in the standard of living of the masses of the people. While recognizing the importance of this factor, the former Prime Minister attributed his defeat also to propaganda and finely calculated violence, the latter having persisted throughout his second term, being particularly heavy during the election year when 800 people lost their lives in political violence. I cannot begin to describe how fascinating all this was to read. Rose's book details has a lot of details about Manley's administration and how the different programs, how he went about them. I mean, I just gave you a little snapshot, but really it is extensive, very detailed about, you know, the plans that he had, the different steps that he took to try to implement them, and just how he met opposition all along the way. And then Blum's book, the section on the CIA intervention in Jamaica is detailed enough, but it actually has a long list of US-led interventions over the past 4 or 5 decades. Talk about Grenada, talk about Guyana, and Cuba, and Haiti. And that's why history is so important. It's so important for us to not just understand, you know, what our leaders, both past and present, you know, have put out there on the table, but that in fact we are not as independent as we think, right?